We got two teams here for you today on the side of government. We have the University of Western Ontario Bruce Tower with Ethan Haas and Stephen Robbins. Some people who came from high schools to all the Western and St. Mary's. Grant Kettles and Bonnie The opposition will be using a split vote, and will the government be using a rebuttal extension? All right, without further ado, I'd like to call for the Prime Minister to defend the motion and stands in
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, I couldn't actually think of a link, so I'm just going to get right to the case. Today we're going to talk about American politics, about the Congressional Black Caucus. The Congressional Black Caucus is a group of congressmen and black congressmen and senators formed in 1969 to advance African American political issues within the United States Congress in the way that caucuses do, by using block voting in order to do political horse trades and advance their priorities within the Democratic Party. Most of them are Democrats, those officially nonpartisan, and within the larger Congress. There's only been one African American member of Congress since 1969, a Republican who wasn't a member. There's never been a non-African American member. Recently, a Democratic Jewish congressman won a seat in a majority black district in Tennessee. This was in 2006. In 2008, a Republican congressman, a Republican Vietnamese congressman, won a majority black district in Louisiana. Both of these people have asked to be members of the Congressional Black Caucus in order to effectively represent the majority of their constituents. They have been turned down by the caucus. We think that they should reconsider that decision and admit them. That they should basically just have. We think that, first of all, open membership more or less works because there's no real motivation to want to be a member unless you believe in their political agenda. In the event that turns out not to be the case, we think the only criteria that they should properly apply is sort of a following the party line membership. So when the caucus decides to block vote on something, people have to stick with that or they get kicked out. Other than that, we don't think they should be applying any standard for membership whatsoever, other than willingness to follow through on helping them with their issues. Yes?
Given that founding members of the Congressional Black Caucus have been advocating for its dissolution since the fighting over Hillary and Obama, is there even any point in admitting these people?
I think they think there's a point in admitting them, and they think they both think there's a lot of utility to the Congressional Black Caucus. For instance, I mean, the Democrat promised in the primaries, in order to allay concerns that he would be ineffective in representing black constituents, that he would join the Congressional Black Caucus. He obviously felt it was an important part of his job, and does still feel it's an important part of his job to be a member of this caucus. I don't think there's any real immediate likelihood of it being dissolved, regardless of what a few members might think. We think there are still definitely African American issues that need advancing, and there should still be a Congressional Black Caucus. So I'm going to talk about three reasons for why we think they should admit these new members. First of all, I'm going to talk about political effectiveness. I'm going to talk about the image of the Congressional Black Caucus, and I'm going to talk about constituent service. So political effectiveness. The broader purpose of having a caucus is in order to advance priorities, not just by voting together on the things that you all agree on, which you would obviously do anyways, but by using a block vote to gain political advantage. So if you have an issue that isn't being addressed, you can go to a group that wouldn't otherwise vote for the issue, that has their own legislative priority, like a group that's supporting relaxation of gun control laws, or any other issue the Congressional Black Caucus might not necessarily support, and say, we'll support you on this bill with this number of votes if you can support us on our bill with this number of votes. Obviously, for these purposes, it's important to have the maximum number of votes behind you in your block in order to negotiate with. So if people want to be a member of the caucus, if they want to lend their support to that, we think that they should welcome that. And that's why just the fact that they agree with their issues isn't enough. They need to be members of the caucus to participate in these sort of strategic votes. Thank you. Next, I'd like to talk about the image of the caucus, because we think that this is hurting the image of the Congressional Black Caucus, and we don't think that it's something that they need to really be doing. As I've said, I think it's beneficial to them. And it's beneficial to them to allow these new members, and it's also, I think, harmful to them to be seen to be excluding people on the basis of race, even if it's not necessarily a particularly like accusation that's advanced with much integrity. When people stand up saying, this is reverse racism, they're forming an exclusively black caucus, we wouldn't allow an exclusively white caucus, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We think that that's sort of a demagogic point that does have some purchase, and we think it's a benefit that they just don't need to give their opposition. There's no real reason to keep these people out. If they really were just trying to get in to score cheap political points, we think if they were allowed in, they basically quickly find there's no real point and leave. And we think it's generally just sort of bad for a group that's large amount of its purpose is fighting racial discrimination to itself be engaging in some form of racial discrimination. Lastly, I want to talk about constituent service, because we think that one of the biggest problems with this is the people who are actually being hurt by this, if at all, are really the constituents of these people who voted for them. There's a certain slate of issues that the caucus shares, but within that group of issues, there are ones that are going to be more or less important to different black communities. And a position within the caucus can be used to sort of advance certain priorities over others. So when you're making a decision to make a political horse trade, you probably won't be able to get every single one of your priorities through. You have to decide which one of these is most important. So it's important to have different communities of black people with different interests represented in the caucus, and we don't think they should be denied representation because they happen to feel they would be best represented by someone who wasn't an African American. And this is also on certain very narrow issues can potentially really hurt the Congressional Black Caucus. For instance, say that when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, there had been actually no black congresspeople from New Orleans in the U.S. House of Representatives. That wasn't the case. But if it had been, and they'd had this rule in place, the Congressional Black Caucus wouldn't have had anyone within their ranks advocating for what was seen as a very important issue for African Americans and the way they're treated in this country. And if they wanted to act as sort of a political voice on the national stage for this issue, they wouldn't have had an actual member of their caucus from New Orleans to address the issue. We think that would have reduced their effectiveness, and we think that it's unfair to the constituents of these people. And we think it's particularly unfair and adds to the image problem that, for instance, in the Louisiana case, they voted out a massively publicly corrupt black congressman in favor of a obviously at this point, I suppose, corrupt Republican congressman. They're basically saying their reward for voting out a massively corrupt congressman is they get less consideration as people who have interests as African Americans in this country. We think that's a real problem. We don't think that that's setting up an incentive system that makes sense. For all of these reasons, the motion must stand. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. So what I propose to do before the House today is to bring up what the constructive material for side opposition is going to be, and then I'm going to spend quite a bit of my speech rebutting what Ethan told you. Because I don't think, frankly, Mr. Speaker, that Ethan really understands what the goals and aims of the Congressional Black Caucus are, what the role of a sort of racial or sort of minority-based caucus is within the representative system. And I further don't think that he's really thought through what the ramifications are of sort of diluting the membership of these groups. So my first point, Mr. Speaker, is what is the purpose of the Congressional Black Caucus? Because, to hear Ethan tell it, Mr. Speaker, the purpose of the Black Caucus is to give a voice to black constituents. But that's not really the goal of the Congressional Black Caucus, Mr. Speaker. The goal of the CBC, which I'm going to refer to it from now on because the other word's ungangly, is basically to increase the proportion and the percentage of black congressmen and senators, Mr. Speaker. The purpose is to increase the voice of African Americans within their legislative house of government, Mr. Speaker, because, as we can see, African Americans are grossly underrepresented in caucus, even in situations where there are majority black districts, Mr. Speaker. And we could argue about whether this is a valid goal of the CBC or not, but the reality, Mr. Speaker, is that to admit in people of other racial backgrounds, Mr. Speaker, fundamentally undermines the goal of increasing the proportion of representation of blacks in the United States that they have in their government system. And we can see other analogies like the NAACP and their scholarship programs, Mr. Speaker. You could argue that giving a scholarship to a very liberal white student who will go on to become an amazing African studies professor is a worthwhile use of the Negro College Fund, Mr. Speaker. But at the end of the day, we think that that's not what that fund exists to do. It exists to increase the circle of opportunity for African American students, and we think that the Congressional Black Caucus works much the same way. The second point I want to talk about is really like a tale of two caucuses, because we see that really, Mr. Speaker, the Congressional Black Caucus is just one caucus of many different caucuses in the United States House of Representatives and the Senate, Mr. Speaker. Because the reality is that, unlike what Ethan told you, the Congressional Black Caucus doesn't set the legislative agenda. It determines what the sort of black community's political response is to the legislative agenda, determined by either the Democratic sort of majority or the Republican minority, Mr. Speaker. And so we see that this is really not about, you know, the Congressional Black Caucus doesn't need to sort of try to bring in every single member who represents a black constituency, Mr. Speaker. The purpose, rather, is to show consistency and visibility within the community, Mr. Speaker, because what it is a show of political solidarity, Mr. Speaker. And so we see, and this really brings me to my third constructive point, which is that it is important for the Congressional Black Caucus to maintain some kind of internal consistency. Because I really think, like, and I'm very hesitant to use kind of slippery slope arguments, right, Mr. Speaker, because like Ethan has asserted that anybody who represents a majority black district should be given sort of entree onto the Congressional Black, entree into the Congressional Black Caucus. Okay, correct me if I'm wrong.
No, I said it should be open in the same way that, say, the Congressional Progressive Caucus is open and people who share their political views.
All right, so like I guess like then this really does kind of ask the question then, like, what is the purpose of a club to which anyone can gain membership, Mr. Speaker? Like you know, like, and I suppose Ethan did say, well, you know, like, only people that are really interested in advancing the black agenda, or the African American agenda, will join it. But the reality, Mr. Speaker, is we don't think that that's like exclusive. We don't think that people need to join the Congressional Black Caucus in order to care about black people. We don't think that, you know, that like Hillary Clinton doesn't care about black people, even though she's not a member of the Congressional Black Caucus. We don't think that Nancy Pelosi doesn't care about black people because she's not a member of the Congressional Black Caucus. Because we see, Mr. Speaker, particularly in the Democratic Party, that members of the Congressional Black Caucus vote with the leadership, vote with the rest of the Democratic Party, and in fact have an enormous amounts of influence in the setting of the legislative agenda. Influence that we argue they would lose if, in fact, the membership, if in fact the internal consistency of the Democratic or of the Black Caucus became so diluted as to be meaningless, they would not be able to speak with one voice that allows them a seat at the table. So now I'm going to engage in some refutation. So Ethan said that this really undermines the political efficacy of the Congressional Black Caucus. And we just don't believe that that's true. Like, there's no reason at all that Ethan advanced to believe that somehow like the Congressional Black Caucus is marginalized by virtue of excluding members based on race. Because certainly, like, that's been its practice up until now. It's been phenomenally successful, especially within the Democratic Party, of advancing the interests of African Americans and trying to enforce particularly elements of the Civil Rights Act that allow for the rise of black voters and black candidates, Mr. Speaker. Because as we've already said, the reality is that members of the Congressional Black Caucus vote along party lines more than they don't, Mr. Speaker. There's no reason that a Vietnamese or Jewish member needs to join the Congressional Black Caucus in order to vote in solidarity along with them, Mr. Speaker. I don't think this compromises efficacy at all. The second point they advance is that it's going to hurt the Congressional Black Caucus's image. And frankly, Mr. Speaker, I think if you buy this argument, you are one of those people who already hates the existence of the Congressional Black Caucus. Because clearly, Mr. Speaker, there are people who on a principled and reasonable basis simply don't believe that there should be, you know, all of these sort of multiplicity of groups. There are people who don't believe that there should be a women's caucus or a Jewish caucus or a black caucus, Mr. Speaker. But the reality is that the admission of other groups isn't going to undermine the argument that these people have against them, Mr. Speaker. Like we said, this isn't like a conference of governors on best practices of representing black constituents. It's about the advancement of a particular group, Mr. Speaker. We think that the people who disagree with this already disagree with this, and their views won't change. But what it will do is dilute the membership base, which will reduce the voice and the power that the Black Caucus has. the last thing Ethan talked about is constituent service. And we think that, like, even if you're not a member of the Black Caucus, we don't think that your duty to represent your constituents and your electoral incentive to do so are diminished in any capacity whatever. He brought up the idea of Katrina, but we don't think that that's a very analogous situation, Mr. Speaker, simply because, we don't think that, that white, congressmen are simply incapable of doing it. For these reasons, and those that Monica is going to bring, we're very proud to oppose.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to introduce one new contention in the round before I refute what Brent told you and reaffirm the purpose of why we should be letting anyone who supports issues that are important to African Americans should be let into the Congressional Black Caucus. And I think I'll use the CBC because it works better for me as well. So, I want to introduce a new contention talking about how we can increase the goal that Brent gave us of having more black politicians. And we think it's actually better to let anyone into the Congressional Black Caucus in their ability to elect black people. Because we think that under the status quo, there's a perception that you need to be black to represent black issues, that you need to be black to participate in the Congressional Black Caucus. And if you aren't, you're not as qualified a representative of these people. You don't have the same voice, you don't have the same ability to stand up and say we represent them. So what it leads to is a situation where minorities can only represent their minority in Congress. And we think that's really harmful because there are very few districts across the United States where there is a majority of people in a given district that are from one specific minority. So if you want to have wide numbers of congressmen, and if you want to have wide numbers of black senators where there are no black majority states in the United States, you need to have a widespread belief in the political system that the color of your skin doesn't matter in your ability to represent your constituents. Yes?
But that's just patently not true. I mean, look at the excitement and the engagement of the African American community with the presence of a black presidential candidate. Clearly it matters to the African American community to have people who look like them represent them.
Sure, there was a massive groundswell of support for President Obama, the first black president. It was something that people didn't expect to see in their lifetime. It was new, it was exciting. But if you look at districts, congressional districts across the United States, black districts tend to vote for black people, and when they don't, we don't think that they should be unfairly disenfranchised in their ability to advocate, their representatives in their ability to advocate for their constituents in Congress. What this is doing is it increases the ability of black politicians to run for higher offices in areas where their specific ethnic group is the minority. Brent told us that the purpose of the stated goal of the caucus was just to increase the proportion of blacks within Congress. And I've told you this is one way we can increase the proportion of blacks within Congress. But we think that the purposes of caucuses in Congress is far beyond that. And it's what Ethan told us about how it's really there to advance African American issues. Because if you're a congressperson and your goal isn't, while you're in Congress, your number one goal isn't to advance the interests of your constituents, that's a big problem, right? That's what they're there for. And I don't think the analogy he used with the NAACP is really all that valid, because the NAACP's stated goal is to advance and increase the proportions of black people in higher professions and give them education, that sort of thing. The goal of any sort of group of black congressmen that are advocating on behalf of African Americans needs to be advocating on behalf of African Americans. And so what we need to have in this situation is that anyone who buys into the policy agenda that's agreed upon by the Congressional Black Caucus should be allowed to participate in the prioritizing and the decisions on horse trading and strategic voting that take place so that they can effectively advocate on the set of those issues. He then told us that the caucus doesn't actually set legislative priorities. It determines, it just determines the black response to political issues. We think that's actually part of the legislative process, right? In that how, sure, the leadership comes up with here are the 3 or 4 main priorities we're going to have in this session from the Democratic leadership or the Republican leadership. But if the Congressional Black Caucus, which is a significant organized group within Congress, says, we don't think these are the right priorities. We think we need to tweak them in this way. That's an effective way to achieve change in Congress. And we think having having these Congressman Cohen and the Congressman from Louisiana in this caucus allows them to actually advocate for their specific constituents' priorities in facilitating that response. He then told us, like, we can't really have a club where anyone can join. And like, we have two responses to this, because like, I don't think there is any harm in having a club that everyone can join, right? If you have a group of people that in Congress that are coming together to, like, if everyone agreed on the African American issues and how to advance them, if they all were working together to achieve those things, we think that's good. But the other response to that is it's not really a club that anyone can join, because you have to be able to be willing to buy into the policy agenda. If you're not willing to vote along the right way on these black issues, then you're not going to be part of the Congressional Black Caucus, and therefore, like, you're not actually going to be a member of it. You have to be supporting the issues and the advancement of African Americans if you're going to be part of the Congressional Black Caucus. We think that's a very good criteria for determining membership. He then told us, like, it needs to be like an inherently consistent group to be able to advocate with like one unified voice. And I don't really get that, because I think people who are representing like African American districts, they have a fairly common set of issues that they're going to be advocating on. And sure, they're going to have like put different weights on different priorities, but they're going to be advocating along their policy goals, right? Like, it's not that like a white congressman representing a black district has a different set of policy goals than someone who is black representing that same district, right? It's still the same unified voice. They still have the same ability to participate in a Congress, in the caucus in a meaningful way. Ethan told you that the role of the caucus is there to advocate for the constituents and the interest group that they have organized to represent. And we think the best way for the Congressional Black Caucus to do this is by including as many members as possible that support their views. Because having more members in the caucus is inherently good. It enables them to be a larger interest group in Congress. It allows them to have more influence over policy decisions, and we think that's a very big benefit. He told us, like, that and it's important for these people to actually be within the caucus, because it's not like they have to be able to vote. They have to actually be able to have their input on the prioritizing, right? Because there's a very big difference between a congressman who gets a chance to say vote yes or no on the like set of issues that are determined by the Congressional Black Caucus, or have an active voice in debating what those issues are. And that's really important, right? Because if they're not in the Congressional Black Caucus, their way of supporting black issues is yes or no. If they're in the Congressional Black Caucus, their way of supporting issues is like, how can we best, like, which issues should we prioritize? This is what's important to my constituents. This is what I think the best way of doing it. That's a very different role for a congressman, and we think that's the best role, and that's the way they should be representing their constituents. He then told us like that some people like don't think we should have these groups at all. These groups are like we shouldn't have these groups at all, and then they're not effective in representing their constituents. Like, we think that like this is a group of people in the United States that has a distinct set of issues. Because of their circumstances, we think that these people need to be represented in Congress by a unified voice. And we think the best way to have that unified voice is that anyone who's interested in advocating for those ideals that are important to black people should be allowed in the Congressional Black Caucus to do the prioritizing and to advance black issues. That's why we propose. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. So I'm not sure how much is left to add after Monica's speech, but I'm going to ask two questions that I think will summarize the round. The first is it a worthy goal in and of itself to simply increase the number of black legislators in Congress? Because we say that it is, and that is the real purpose of the Black Caucus, and that anything that derogates from that purpose is not legitimate. The second question I'm going to ask is, does it take a black person to represent a black district? And if not, then does sort of keeping a Vietnamese or Jewish representative rob those constituents of representation? And we think that it does not. So my first point is it a worthy goal to elect more black representatives? Because we get the idea from side government that it shouldn't matter who the representative is, that the only sort of criterion for membership in the Black Caucus is who the constituents are. That like if you represent enough black constituents and serve their issues in some way, you should become a member. But what Monica and I have consistently told you is that the purpose of the Black Caucus is to increase the number of actual black legislators. And Monica told you about the importance importance of visibility. The reality is that it is important in the United States to have a visible core of African American legislators to show the media that there is a presence, a core of people who cannot be ignored, whose constituents' issues cannot be ignored. And as I raised on a POI, I think it is fundamentally important for African Americans in the United States to see that there are people who look like them within their government. We think it is fundamentally important for blacks to feel that they have ownership and some skin in the game, as Barack Obama has put it. We think that fundamentally it is important for them to sort of look at Congress and say, you know, we get this idea actually from side government that it hurts the CBC to have this sort of race-based admission. But like, I think it's kind of a watered down vision of the dream that like, so long as it's a minority, it just doesn't matter who represents them. Like, we think the ultimate goal is to have a full complement, a proportional complement of African American legislators in the Congress, Mr. Speaker. And we think that sort of watering it down so just like any person who cares about black people can be admitted doesn't achieve the goal. The second question is, does it take a black person to represent a black district, and does banning a non-black person rob black constituents of their representation? Because I think we're all agreed that there aren't, as Monica told you, a unique set of black issues that can only be addressed by black people. But if there aren't, Mr. Speaker, and if we don't use race, what is the bar for entry to the Black Caucus? Well, they say that it should just be anybody who wants to advocate for black people. But we also think that this is open for abuse, Mr. Speaker. What if Trent Lott, after making his racist comments, decided that a good way to get over his scandal was to join the Black Caucus on the promise that he would advocate for black issues for a week? The reality, Mr. Speaker, is, as Monica told you, the club is Congress. The club of people who care about black issues is the Democratic Party. If you care about those issues, you join those caucuses, Mr. Speaker, not try to join the Black Caucus and dilute its message and its purpose. For those reasons, I'm proud to oppose it.
Prime Minister, close the round.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, I learned a lot about the Congressional Black Caucus from the opposition. I learned that they're a group promoting the visibility, purely the visibility of black politicians who hold closed-door, hard-nosed political strategy sessions to advance legislation. I learned that those strategy sessions are complicated because there's a wide variety of black issues. You have to hammer out exactly what your priorities are, but you don't need to be in those meetings to actually participate in that process because they have phones and you can call them. And I learned that there are no Republicans ever in the Congressional Black Caucus, except I learned something that wasn't true. Because there have been Republicans in the Congressional Black Caucus. There haven't been many black Republican congressmen, but 3 of those that were members of the Congressional Black Caucus. The remaining one wasn't, and that's sort of the point. The remaining one wasn't a member of the Congressional Black Caucus because he didn't agree with their conception of what politics should be, of what black issues were, and he didn't want to join on to their political agenda. We think that is the real thing they should be looking at who is membership, not simply race. And regarding caucuses, they talked about, Trent Lott's going to join the caucus to gain PR, and they talked about a bunch of other caucuses, the Hispanic caucus, the Women's caucus. I think, the principles we're saying about the Congressional Black Caucus would equally apply to those, but they also didn't talk about a bunch of other caucuses, like the Congressional Progressive Caucus, like the Congressional Blue Dog Caucus for fiscal responsibility, like the Republican Study Group. All these groups are ideological, and somehow they seem to have managed to survive for a while without members of opposing ideologies just joining as a publicity stunt to somehow sabotage them. We think that that's why you form a caucus, and rather than just make these assertions, I'd ask you, why would you form this specific, a caucus is not just another word for a group, right? A caucus is a group of legislators formed within the body of a legislature. If you really wanted a group to advance politicians, why aren't, say, black governors and black mayors and black state senators also members of the Congressional Black Caucus? Because that's not its primary purpose. Its primary purpose is a political action group within the U.S. Congress to advance the black agenda within the U.S. Congress. That's why it's a caucus. If they really want a club to advance black politicians, they can form a club to advance black politicians. There's nothing stopping them. Congressmen are people. They can incorporate a non-profit organization as well if they really need that. And that's what fundamentally all of their analogies about, say, how giving black scholarships to white people who sympathize with black people isn't the point, because the point of scholarships is to get black people into university. The point of congressmen is to pass laws, is to legislate things, it has immediate consequences on what gets done. And yes, many of these congressmen may sympathize with most of the Congressional Black Caucus issues, and they may want to support them on most things, but nevertheless, as they pointed out, it's not a unified slate of agendas. It means they're not represented in the Congressional Black Caucus by themselves. If they feel that their constituents' particular priorities within the larger field of black issues are being slighted, they may not block vote with the caucus in these tactical votes. They may not support them on issues that are not purely ideological, it's strategic in nature, and for all of these reasons, this motion must stand.